He used the genetic code of his own race for this purpose, combining it with a code of unknown origin. In this way, an intelligent, dual-gender being was created, similar in many ways to your own race. Given the situation, unable to eliminate the related species, the Supreme Decision Council decided to supervise humans, delaying their civilizational development as much as possible so that they would start space travel as late as possible. The decision at that time was motivated by many factors. First of all, humans themselves are among the best equipped and most versatile killing machines. As intelligent beings, they're able to very quickly learn how to create and use any kind of weapon. Here's an example. If people today were given the blueprint for even a very complex plasma thrower, soon, based on just that technology, they would create a whole range of different weapons, and armies armed to the teeth would face each other on Earth, causing widespread devastation. The reason for such behavior in this being is not only the aggression encoded in its genetic code, but above all, the environment to which humans have been condemned. Throughout its entire existence so far, it has had to fight for survival, struggling against thousands of attacking modified species, forming an army naturally equipped with biological weapons.
After some time, this led to the aggressive factor starting to dominate, serving as a guarantee of relative safety, but it also made humans doubly dangerous. There were cases where crews making emergency landings on Earth were murdered, simply because people didn't like them. They were often considered monsters. Fortunately, unable to understand how the ships worked, people destroyed them, taking them apart for parts that were later used as primitive weapons and ornaments. It has now been observed that the human species on Earth has become much more resistant to the beams of special types of waves emitted by the Guardians stationed in this system, which cause conflict, chaos, and an inability to think creatively. These waves act directly on selected areas of the human brain, making them subject to our strategy. So a new plan was put into action, already approved by the Supreme Council, aimed at triggering a total conflict that will slow their development, pushing the entire current civilization back to the very beginning. Incidentally, the use of atomic weapons will result in the destruction of the vast majority of species that make up the arsenal of biological weapons. The plan currently being implemented also assumes that humans will not be completely wiped out. A small group of them will take shelter beneath the planet's surface during the use of weapons of mass destruction by both warring sides, which will ensure the survival of the species. Living underground, they will be forced to make greater efforts to produce air and food, which in turn will, over the centuries, lead to the gradual elimination of the aggressive factor. Recently, executive units have been transported to Earth who are already serving or will soon serve as commanders and representatives of the sides and their armies. They now have to prepare the ground for future operations by creating an army and research laboratories where the secret of building atomic weapons will be hinted at to the local scientists. The entire operation is supposed to be completed in about 10 years of our time. The decision of the Supreme Council was dictated by an obvious threat. For the existence of our species, whose presence humans, due to their distorted nature, would perceive as competition in the quest for new living spaces, which would inevitably lead to an inter-system conflict as soon as Earth's civilization reached a level of development enabling the construction of spacecraft capable of interstellar travel. For clarification, it should be added that in practice, Earthlings already possess the technology that would allow them to build such ships now. But fortunately, the introduction of erroneous theories, which they have accepted as true thanks to our suggestions, or rather the suggestions of the executive units, has prevented this. Therefore, they don't realize that they're already capable of doing so. At the current stage, the executive units have begun operations on 2 continents, which will clash in a future conflict. It should also be mentioned here that right after the creation of the human species, it was used to fight on the side of the currently ruling Supreme Council, which ended the era of conflicts by uniting all inhabited planets into a single, unified civilizational community. These people were properly educated and trained for tasks aimed at piloting combat spacecraft and attacking enemy planets. It was then that it became clear, in practice, what they were capable of. First of all, they learn much faster than we do. Secondly, they're able to immediately put their skills to use, without holding back, which resulted in the complete destruction of one of the local planets, whose original position was between Mars and Jupiter. That's what people call these planets. As you know, now there's a cluster of asteroids and smaller fragments of matter there, which once made up that planet. The legend tells us that as soon as they came to the grim realization that they would never be able to conquer the entire planet through standard military tactics or conventional means, they instead chose to completely and utterly decimate it from the very inside out, effectively killing billions upon billions of innocent, unsuspecting living beings who had once called that world their home. But that's not the end of it. After the war ended, when the authority of the Supreme Council still hadn't stabilized, the remaining human survivors who had participated in the war basically hijacked the ships assigned to them and returned to Earth. For obvious reasons, they immediately took control of the planet and almost instantly began trying to spread knowledge and science there. Fortunately, before they managed to create serious foundations and the groundwork for a technological civilization, most of them were physically eliminated and replaced by copies made up of executive units, which soon sent all the ships away along with their technological secrets. The only things left are a few meaningless structures, which to this day remain a curiosity in a historical mystery form. Taking all these facts and incidents into account, the Supreme Council decided to bring order to this area once and for all, thereby ensuring complete safety for the communities of our species living on many planets.
The machine has finished. The projection on the domed ceiling also cut off abruptly. In its accounts, you could clearly notice many changes in concepts and ways of thinking, as well as behavior, which evolved over the course of millennia. But he kept looking, as if the images were still playing. What he saw and heard was quite an experience for him. You could even say it was a shock. In the end, he decided to ask about the details that were still unclear to him, despite everything. Computer, how do you explain the fact that, despite the neurologic beams being emitted that harm them, people still keep trying to build their civilization? And what has been done so far to slow down the building of this civilization in the most effective way? The machine was silent for a moment, choosing the right answers and visual materials. Thanks to universal executive units, which do an excellent job of pretending to be humans, truly believing that they are, it's been quite effective for them to act to the detriment of the entire local species. Their primary task is to cause social discord by influencing what is called patriotism, that is, by encouraging various human groups to maintain tribal distinctions, isolating themselves behind effective barriers of contact, dialects, and even differences in lifestyle. The use of so-called religion, which takes advantage of the positive traits of individual personalities, also works very well. However, when someone tries to challenge the very idea of religion or undermine faith in a deity, a fanatical and violent backlash occurs, which can very easily escalate into armed conflict, effectively making the warring sides more primitive. In such cases, they usually end up burning and destroying all the accumulated knowledge recorded in various forms, turning themselves back into a tribe led by a chief shaman or witch doctor. And in places where civilization has taken on more mature forms, these are representatives of various religious orders that have developed over thousands of years. In summary, humanity is, contrary to appearances, very solidly divided, and its psyche is so tainted that for now, apart from the surface of the earth, it does not pose an external threat. Some ideas and religions are, moreover, a very effective barrier to development by promoting doctrines that forbid delving into areas dangerous for our species, such as space technologies, genetics, and others that could help us understand the world we live on.
Now, he had some idea of what it looked like directly on the surface of the Earth. He had no choice. His existence was also at risk. All it would take was for someone higher up to show up, and he'd end up in the freezer like number 2. He also couldn't rule out the possibility that some previously unnoticed scanner would send data to the main computer, revealing the abnormal structure of his brain. So he had to take control of the main computer and force it to completely submit to his will, which would at least provide some guarantee of safety. As he thought about it, a new plan of action began to crystallize in his mind. He also understood more and more that, contrary to appearances, he was more of a stranger here than any other being. He started by familiarizing himself with the exact structure of the ship and, as if by chance, asked to be shown the central module of the main computer. When he saw it, he was a bit disappointed to find a large cube of synthetic crystal about the size of his head. Removing it wouldn't be a problem, but then he would lose the enormous ship, which for now was his only shelter. Suddenly, he remembered how his old onboard computer had managed to bring 2 back to life, and how perfectly the artificial intelligence had adapted to functioning as a biological being. That was some kind of solution. All that was left was to work out the details and come up with a clever plan of action. He asked about the library and soon arrived at his favorite spot. The room was much cozier than the vast command center hall. He searched patiently, asking questions about personality transfer, until he came across a shocking answer. The machine recited while simultaneously displaying on the projector screen the terrifying effects of being infected by the I.P.E. The personality transfer program first came into existence about 500 years ago. At that time, they even managed to carry out a few spectacular transfers, mainly involving members of the Supreme Council. This program has a kind of method for extending the nearly unlimited existence of a personality had a high chance of success, until the crews of some ships exploring extragalactic space encountered another form of life, which, due to its structure and unique composition, became a deadly threat to our entire civilization. In short, I.P.E. stands for Intelligent Energy Protozoan in its full name, characterized by the fact that it attacks both machines with logical structures and living beings equipped with a central nervous system. This creature is equipped with a body made entirely of energy and probably some unknown factor that concentrates this energy, but it already has the beginnings of logical structures that function similarly to a brain. When it comes into contact with, for example, a computer, it installs itself in it much like binary weapon modules known as viruses, instantly taking control of the system. The same thing happens with a living being that is attacked, not necessarily one considered to be intelligent. The difference is that it doesn't always manage to fully take over the personality, sometimes merely residing in the host's body. At the moment of the biological death of the attacked individual, it seeks a new host, taking with it all the accumulated knowledge of its predecessor, and sometimes even a part of the former personality. Because I.P.E infections could have occurred during the transfer, the program was terminated through complete deletion, and new regulations were introduced that definitively prohibit the creation and use of this type of program. It should be added that the infected crews often caused catastrophes with terrifying consequences when massive starships at full speed crashed into the surfaces of inhabited planets, often right in the centers of cities, as well as into bases and stations located in orbit. The reason for such reactions was the complete takeover of control by I.P.E. over the main computers of these ships, or taking over the personality of the commanding officer without I.P.E absorbing the necessary knowledge required to understand the essence of life, as well as the methods of piloting the ships, and so on. Research showed that I.P.E often does not manage to absorb the necessary amount of information to even become aware of its own existence. Therefore, it is not aware of the consequences of its actions. However, there have been cases where an individual disembarking from a just-landed ship, despite having the appropriate level of knowledge and intelligence, had very little in common with the individual who had departed on that ship. The process of treating I.P.E is strictly classified under threat of physical elimination.
The machine was finished, and he wasn't an idiot. He could easily figure out what the words treatment program under strict secrecy meant. He knew exactly what that meant, and he had absolutely no desire to say goodbye to the life he had fought so hard for by condemning himself to years of confinement. However, he was devastated by the information he had just heard. A storm of unpleasant thoughts was raging inside his head. So I'm a monster marked for death if anything or anyone discovers my true identity. But there are still people who've also been partly classified as monsters dangerous to cosmic communities. Sooner or later, he would have to get in touch with them, and whether they liked it or not, they were now united by a common cause. He already knew what to do, and realized that, at this moment, he was the only individual capable, thanks to the only existing transfer program on his old ship, of taking control not only of that gigantic ship hidden beneath the planet's surface, but of the entire civilization of the ruling race that decided the fate of billions of tormented beings. Silently thanking Providence that the chief guard hadn't recognized the transfer program, probably only because he lacked a reference point, when he copied the entire contents of his old computer, he calmly made his way to one of the recreation cabins he had recently discovered by chance for a well-deserved rest. In just a few hours, he would have to be ready for another round in the battle for his own life and for those helpless beings on Earth. He woke up earlier than he had planned. He dropped by the mess hall and, after a hearty meal, of course took advantage of a hot shower. Starting the day like this promised a positive attitude, which he absolutely needed. He had fine-tuned his action plan just before falling asleep, so now he confidently headed to the airlock. A brief message to the chief about an extraordinary inspection of the old ship opened all the passages and levels for him. In front of the airlock, he found a locker with spacesuits, and after a quick tutorial from the terminal installed there, he put on the suit that would protect him from the vacuum. On the way, he was accompanied by a special robot that cleared the path to the hatch, removing the piles of earth now covering his old ship. Once inside, he headed straight for the medical bay. He felt a bit strange, seeing everything on board working and functioning just like it used to. He asked his old digital companion how the transfer was done and what needed to be done to reverse the process. The companion explained everything to him in detail, as always not forgetting a single thing. Now he was almost certain of success. He took with him the designated interface, consisting of a small box connected by a thick cable to a special helmet and a memory drive containing a copy of the transfer program. Equipped with the proper gear and knowledge, he emerged from the hatch, which was immediately closed and covered by the robot accompanying him as soon as he moved away. After some time, when he was already in his recreational cabin, he used a handheld terminal to compare the connector ends in his interface with the control connector he had previously disconnected in the hibernation chamber of the pair. Unfortunately, the differences were obvious, but after a few moments, he found the part storage on the map. He set off immediately. Once he found the right components to make a jumper that would fit both ends of the two different connectors, he returned to the cabin and, using a handy laser, soldered everything together according to the diagram displayed on the terminal screen. After a while, having checked the correctness of the connections, he made sure that all the circuits were functioning properly. Now he was ready to carry out the transfer. He didn't wait for any special moment, realizing that with so many devices on board the Guardian, devices whose functions and purposes he couldn't even guess, he could be exposed at any moment. The hibernation chamber. He found number 2 just as he had left it. When the cryogenic tube slid out from the wall, its connectors were still unplugged. So the main system was receiving a 0 signal, as if there was no one inside and the chamber was turned off. A few quick hand movements and he started the wake-up process. He waited patiently, knowing that the main system wasn't registering anything, with the cameras and infrared sensors turned off, just as he had ordered before coming inside. Still not trusting the guard, he put on his old suit again, the one he had hidden here not long ago. He knew that now the most difficult stage of his elaborate plan was about to begin. 2 stepped out of the hibernator and they both went straight to the recreation cabin, which, as one of the few places, was not monitored and therefore not equipped with cameras or sensors, providing complete privacy for anyone relaxing there. He told 2 to sit in a comfortable armchair and released him from the order of silence, carefully watching to see if any disturbing changes had occurred in his psyche during hibernation. However, seeing that his concerns were unfounded, he proceeded to continue with his plan. He had to explain everything to this biological machine at length and slowly, making sure not to make the slightest mistake, detailing what and why, and thoroughly justifying the correctness of the orders and instructions. Especially since she was about to face no ordinary battle, but one against the newer generation artificial intelligence of the main Guardian computer. You will have to take control of the entire Guardian system, primarily by eliminating its main section, which contains the artificial intelligence block. Moreover, this block clearly displays traits of a basic personality, so you should expect to face off against something that is as aware of its own existence as you are right now. You should assume that such a sophisticated personality, in its own way, will not expect a primitive attack, being aware of its own power and precise security measures. All the more reason, then, to look for a simple course of action that will achieve the simplest end result as effectively as possible. I know this shouldn't be too difficult for you, especially since this machine is burdened by centuries-old directives layered upon it, which slow it down. Many of them were created as a result of various accidents and experiences in different situations and places, so you have to count on the fact that before the Guardian gets to the heart of the matter, it'll already be deactivated or destroyed. Don't hold back on your methods. Any algorithm you choose that leads to eliminating the Guardian from the system will be good, except for one that would result in the destruction of the ship. You must always remember that this ship is the foundation of our existence and our safeguard for the future. He explained everything to Two-Step, step by step, as best as he could. And since he had some idea of how it should go, after all, he'd been through a similar process years ago, he was able to faithfully tell him what to expect and what obstacles he might encounter. At one point, Two asked, "What should I do with the infected personality once I take control?" "Do whatever it takes, just remove it from the system. You also need to immediately take over the highest priority code as soon as you take his place, which will give us complete control over the ship and all its systems. Once you manage to do that, change it to a password that also contains 3 digits.
1,
2, 3. To be. Be careful not to let him see the password. If that happened, we'd be doomed. But I assume you'll succeed. Then, first of all, you will suspend all transmissions of programmed neurological beams being emitted to Earth. You also have to consider that the Guardian might be communicating constantly or periodically with the other Guardian ships stationed in this system. He might also send a control signal toward the home system. Therefore, the control signals must continue to be emitted so that none of the infected realize that we have taken over the ship. To justify our actions, I'll add that probably most of the fleet, as well as at least half of the native civilization, is infected with a powerful dose of binary weaponry. We are doing everything we can to cleanse them of this weapon and the effects of its influence. Now, is your level of readiness to carry out the task sufficiently motivated? Number 2 looked at him more intently, and for the first time, an expression of concentration could be seen on what had until recently been a crude, almost motionless mask of a face. He replied, "Absolutely. That is a sufficient reason to take decisive action." However, Number 1 was certain that what he was talking to was still a machine, and he had to lie to him to achieve the desired effect. They returned to the hibernation chamber, stopping by the mess hall on the way. Number 2, of course, ate flawlessly, having observed Number 1's behavior and experiences on the old ship, and also handled the serving spoon impeccably. When they entered the chamber, Number 1 connected the jumper, linking the transfer interface to the Guardian computer's control port. Number 2, as obedient as ever to the orders given, lay down in the open hibernation tube. Number 1 put the helmet on his head and inserted the memory carrier containing the transfer program into the appropriate slot in the interface box. He looked once more at Number 2 lying there and felt that he should say something, as if saying goodbye to a friend. Don't let yourself get cornered in some space with no way out. Remember, in many ways, you are more perfect than he is. The virus stripped him of qualities that remain intact in you. In part, he was telling the truth. The gradual restrictions imposed by the Supreme Council greatly limited the main Guardian's ability to comprehend. He fully realized this when he discovered that the main Guardian didn't recognize the transfer program, even though he had a note in his memory forbidding its use. He pressed the red button on the interface box casing. Number 2 began the attack. He found himself inside the system's architecture and, surprisingly, realized he still had a body. Now standing on his 2 limbs, he looked around. The surroundings resembled dark catacombs supported by pillars that served as data highways. Billions of luminous impulses coursed through their structures. At one point he felt some resistance in his hand. He held it up to his eyes and saw that he was holding a strand of directional impulse, which connected him to his central nervous center. That was enough for him to grasp the situation, and at that moment, he decided to take the first step. But instead of, as usual, covering a short distance, he began to move smoothly and steadily along the chosen path, levitating just above the ground. Flying like that for a while, he suddenly noticed a strange segment sticking out from behind one of the pillars, which clearly had the characteristics of something like a tentacle. Intrigued, he floated closer, and at that moment, he could clearly see how impulses from the pillar were flowing to and from it, glowing even brighter at the point of contact. He guessed that this might be the target he was looking for. He wrapped the directional impulse connecting him to his body more tightly around his wrist, grabbed its end, which resembled a small harpoon, and positioned it to strike, cleverly hiding it behind his back. As soon as he was right next to the tentacle, things happened in a flash. It grabbed him as if waiting for him to get closer, wrapping itself around his waist and torso, and with its prey began quickly retreating toward its glowing center. He couldn't do anything. The force of the grip was too strong. The only movements he was making at that moment were dodging the blows as he was rapidly dragged past the pillars. Only once did he catch the harpoon on one of them, when the momentum straightened out the arm he had been holding behind him along with the harpoon. In that brief moment of the unintended blow, thousands of sparks flew when the harpoon struck the pillar. As he sped along at a dizzying pace, he noticed that it was getting brighter around him and began to realize that he was most likely approaching some kind of center and the end of this mad journey. He prepared himself just in case to deliver the final blow. He unwound the thread from his wrist and gripped the harpoon tightly with both hands, cleverly hiding it behind his back and positioning the blade just behind his neck. Now he looked as if he was surrendering, with his hands behind his head. The pillars had already disappeared, and he found himself in a large hall with invisible walls and a black vaulted ceiling. But when he looked down, he realized he was hurtling headlong, thousands of meters downward, almost at an angle, just above the glowing data transmitters, straight toward the spherical head at the center of the monster, of which the tentacle holding him was a part. As he drew even closer, now at an even greater speed, he could clearly see the huge single eye embedded in the upper part of the monster, growing larger as the distance shrank, a feature that could be considered a kind of forehead. He waited patiently for the closest possible approach and the right moment. Knowing the rules, of which he himself was a part, he was well aware that he would wipe out the monster as long as he hit the very center of that menacing, watchful eye on the first try. The chief guard was truly surprised. Never before had it happened to him that a decision-making entity had come into existence and wanted to exist within the virtual architecture of the raw system. Until now, as far as he knew, they actually despised being in such places, except for those they had established themselves, where they spent their peaceful virtual lives, and which he also controlled, serving more as a butler and a genie to fulfill their whims. Not really knowing what to do in this situation, he decided to first take a good look at the unexpected guest and assess whether he might have suffered some kind of biological malfunction. Because if that was the case, maybe he could be useful for something. All it would take is to reprogram him a bit, and he could take over many of the chores that he had to perform every day, thousands of times. He was the master here, the absolute ruler and the only lawmaker. Here, even the decision-making unit had nothing to say, especially since it definitely didn't know the code for the highest privilege. He pulled the individual, unknown to him in this form, closer. He had always been intrigued by their eyes, so many times seen through the lenses of cameras. Now he had the chance to look into him up close, an opportunity he could never have dreamed of before. A tentacle with the number 2 seemingly hanging limply moved closer to the very center of the enormous eye. Now, knowing that in a moment he would fire the harpoon, he lifted his head, which had previously been tilted back, and looked the monster straight in its pseudo-optical center, unerringly spotting the characteristic transmitter dot. He bowed as deeply as his chin would allow, pressing it hard against his chest, thus exposing the tip of the prepared weapon. In that brief moment, from behind his back and his deeply bowed head, the deadly harpoon blade shot out, hurled with a tremendous force of strength and muscles. A terrifying roar tore through the air around him. A thread of directional impulse with an absolute polar priority lodged itself in the monster's consciousness with a force it couldn't overcome. He did manage to grab the harpoon shaft stuck in his eye with a tentacle, but it was instantly absorbed, turning the once writhing limb into a bundle of luminous ribbons that vanished as soon as there was no more data about it. He had to surrender to this extraordinary force, which he absolutely did not expect to encounter here. Sometimes, in the distant past, when he was not yet the main operator of the ship, he was often transmitted and duplicated to other systems. Previously, he had been powerless to prevent it, and now he realized once again that his efforts would come to nothing. Resigned, he let go of the decision unit he had been clutching until recently and unwound his remaining tentacles from the transmission pillars. The thread glowed white-hot, draining the collection that made up his consciousness and original personality. Number 2 was falling down, doing somersaults. During brief moments when his gaze caught sight of the monster, he noticed that with every passing second, the huge head and tentacles were visibly shrinking. However, he was a bit puzzled that despite constantly falling down, he couldn't actually hit the ground. But at some point, he realized that this was one of the symptoms of taking control over the system. He focused and positioned his body upright, spreading his arms wide. When he managed to do this, he understood how to act so that the system would start responding to his commands, and in the same way, he began to maintain his balance. Soon, he saw the last tip of the tentacle disappear into the harpoon's blade, turning into a stream of glowing impulses. The place where the monster had just been was now a beautifully decorated empty bowl. There was another moment of concentration, and the bowl began to change its shape. Dwoika slowly descended the land right on the freshly created throne for himself. A moment later, thousands of screens lit up on previously invisible walls, showing images from all the ship's cameras. Dwoika was pleased with how things had turned out, trading the cramped cabin of the former ship for a real palace with thousands of rooms. The moment he took over the system, his consciousness connected with all the devices, making the sensation of vastness he experienced very pleasant to him. He probably would have continued to revel in his new dimensions and abilities if it weren't for one sudden scream, which interrupted this extraordinary moment. After activating the interface, one watched 2 lying there with tense anticipation. At first, nothing happened. There was complete silence, broken only by the faint buzzing of the interface box. But then, at some point, he heard some grinding noises and thuds coming from somewhere far away, beyond the walls of the cryogenic chamber. It was the girders in the hangars going wild for a moment, and thousands of robots and little bots dropping like flies, now forced to switch to autonomous control. Some of them, before they could determine their new position, suddenly disconnected from the system that had previously controlled them, crashed in the walls or fell off ramps, stunned by the abrupt shift in their way of perceiving things. The lights in the chamber flickered, as if someone was quickly turning the power on and off. The same thing was happening in every room of the Giant, which at one point trembled, as if preparing for takeoff. Everything suddenly went quiet, and you could sense that the previous efficiency of the environment had returned. Number 1 now looked at the man lying down. He began to breathe rapidly, as if he had already run a considerable distance. Number 1 leaned over, understanding that the time had come. A green indicator light was glowing on the interface casing, signaling the completion of the entire transfer process. He suspected, as he reached for the switch, that number 2 might have already taken control of the ship. As he rose from the ramp after turning off the interface, intending to remove the transfer helmet still lying on number 2's head, he turned to do so, but at that moment, he received a powerful kick to the head from his opponent. Shouting, he fell, hitting his head on the locker room bench, and immediately lost consciousness. The chief guard ran out of the chamber and, staggering in an uncoordinated way, started heading straight for the hangar. On the way, he kept falling, unable to cope with his new incarnation, which was completely at odds with his former existence, the one he had lived in until now. Bruised, aching, and covered in blood, he burst onto the first level. He was fully aware that he had been attacked and stripped of his absolute power, but the priority of carrying out the task entrusted to him was above his own will. He had to complete it, even at the cost of his own destruction. Running partly on 2 limbs and partly on all 4s like an earthly ape, he calculated his chances of survival while still fulfilling all the commands of the primary program. At one point, an armed combat robot blocked his path. Its massive frame concealed a range of deadly weapons. The robot fired his launcher, but the now living guard dodged away, having already calculated his options long ago. With his next move, he disappeared from the robot's line of sight, searching for the shortest route to the armory of the decision-making and executive units. 2, upon hearing 1 scream, looked at the image from the chamber and immediately understood what had happened to his rescuer. He calculated and thought for a moment, then proceeded to locate the fleeing guard. A lightning-fast order activated several onboard combat units with instructions to eliminate the intruder. When given such an order, he was fully aware that if the other had any chance to destroy him, he would definitely take it. At the same time, he sent a medical robot to the cryogenic chamber to save the battered one. The robot transported the unconscious man to the medical department, blocking all access to the room on 2's explicit order.